You were never meant to know what happened in Millerville, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1891. The story was buried under 30 years of silence, sealed files, and dead witnesses. Not because it was a simple crime, but because it revealed something too sickening, too calculated. What you're about to hear was hidden from the public for over 100 years. If you dare to listen, subscribe, like, and share, because once we start, there's no turning back. About the kind of power that hides in plain sight. Picture it. A basement beneath the abandoned Millerville Opera House. 17 bodies chained upright to the damp stone walls, the stench of human rot still clinging to the air. But these weren't corpses pulled from fresh graves. No, each one was alive, and yet officially dead. Their death certificates had been filed months, even years earlier, scattered across 3 different counties. Someone had erased them from the living world long before they stopped breathing. The man behind it, Cornelius Venaar, wore the mask of a respectable showman for more than a decade. He traveled under the banner of Venaar's Cabinet of Wonders, a circus of freaks, marvels, and impossible curiosities that drew laughing children and gawking adults into its bright tents. But the lights, the laughter, the applause, it was all a veil. Behind it was one of the most methodical programs of human exploitation in American history. The local paper never printed the truth. Witnesses were paid in gold or silenced with threats. The officials who should have stopped it profited from it, some for years. Because in Millerville, power didn't care about law or morality. Power cared only about its own survival. This is the anatomy of control. You see it in every age, every country, every empire. Distract the public with spectacle, build trust in the face you show them, and hide the real machinery in the shadows where no one looks until it's too late. And in 1891, that machinery was about to be exposed, not by the law, not by a hero, but by a single, terrified witness who had seen it all from the inside, and who was never meant to live long enough to speak. Millerville in 1891 was a town straddling 2 worlds. The old Pennsylvania countryside with its quiet hills and German immigrant farms was being swallowed by the machinery of industry. Coal mines clawed into the earth. The new branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad had brought steel, smoke, and a flood of people chasing the promise of wages, 8,000 souls, many fresh from Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe. They came to work the mines, to sweat in the foundries, and most of all, to disappear into the rhythm of survival. Here, no one asked questions that might slow a man's work. No one cared where you came from if you paid your debts and kept your mouth shut. Boy, that kind of willful blindness was a perfect shield for Cornelius Venaar. He needed a place where people minded their own business, where curiosity was punished by misfortune, and where the line between accident and murder was paper thin. Venaar himself was hard to miss, tall, immaculately dressed, with a voice that could silence a room. He claimed to be the son of a wealthy Dutch family in New York, but no one ever checked. His money was real, and in Millerville, that was all that mattered. Shopkeepers loved him, nattered. Tavern owners welcomed him. He bought the old opera house in 1887, claiming it would serve as winter quarters for his traveling show. And the town, flattered to host a man of culture and wealth, never looked deeper. On the surface, the Cabinet of Wonders was exactly what it promised. Acrobats, animal acts, music, and a freak show that rivaled anything in the state. There was Eliza, the bone serpent woman, whose body bent in ways that defied anatomy. There was Giant Y, the Bavarian colossus towering nearly 8 feet tall and bending iron with his hands. And there was little Mary Catherine, the singing angel, a young woman with a voice so pure it drew tears, though her sleeves were always long, hiding the arms she did not have. The audience saw marvels. They never saw the chain. They never knew that many of these performers had not volunteered, that they were not merely part of the show, they were the show, chosen, taken, reshaped into what Venaar wanted them to be. And in the autumn of 1891, the first crack in his perfect illusion was about to open, brought on by the one thing his system couldn't control. A mistake. It began with a rainstorm. Not a gentle autumn drizzle, but a black, unbroken downpour that turned Millerville streets into rivers and flooded the low-lying alleys behind the opera house. Water poured through the cracked mortar of the old building's foundation, seeping into the hidden basement Venaar thought no one would ever enter. That night, a 17-year-old coal hauler named Thomas Greeley was making his way home from the tavern. He'd had too much beer, too little food, and took the narrow alley as a shortcut, the one that ran behind the opera house. He slipped on the slick cobblestones, crashing into a section of wall where the rainwater was pooling. That's when he heard it. At first it was just noise under the thunder, a sound he thought was the wind trapped in the masonry. But then it came again, ragged and wet, the sound of someone breathing where no one should be. Thomas pressed his ear to the stone. Beneath the steady roar of rain, he heard the low, desperate moan of a human voice. Fear sobered him fast. He circled to the stage door, which had been left ajar, and stepped into darkness. The smell hit him before his eyes adjusted, a suffocating reek of rot and mildew that clawed its way into his throat. Guided by the sound, he found the warped wooden stairs that led downward, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew colder, heavier. At the bottom, the beam of his lantern caught them, a row of faces, pale and motionless, their eyes tracking him in unison. Chains rattled softly as they strained to see who had come. He counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 70. The sight was wrong in a way his mind could barely hold. They were alive, but every one of them looked like the dead. A woman's lips trembled, forming a word he couldn't hear over the pounding of his own heart. Then, from the farthest corner, a voice rose, hoarse, cracked, but unmistakable. "Help, please." That was when Thomas made the second mistake of the night. He stepped closer. The chain snapped tight before Thomas even understood what was happening. It was the woman in the corner, the one who had spoken. Her arms shot forward as far as the shackle would allow, fingers clawing the air, desperate to seize him. Not in malice, but in panic. Her nails scraped the skin of his wrist, leaving 4 bright lines of blood. Thomas froze, his breath ragged, his lantern shaking in his hand. In that moment, he realized the weight of what he was seeing. These weren't circus performers waiting for their next show. They were prisoners. And not just prisoners, people who, by every record, every official piece of paper in Pennsylvania, were already dead. The woman's eyes darted past him, toward the staircase. Her mouth moved again. This time, the word was clear. "Go." That's when the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Appa. The sound echoed in the stone chamber, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps descending toward him. Thomas's lantern trembled harder now, casting warped shadows against the walls. The prisoners all recoiled, chains rattling in sudden, synchronized fear. Whatever was coming down those stairs wasn't new to them. The figure emerged into the light. Cornelius Venner. His coat was buttoned to the throat, despite the heat of the basement, and in his hand he carried a slender cane, tipped with polished silver. He didn't look surprised to see Thomas, only mildly inconvenienced, as though catching a stray dog rooting through his pantry. "A curiosity," Venner said, his voice smooth, almost musical, "is a dangerous appetite, Miss Greeley." Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lantern slipped in his grip, and the light swung wildly across the room, illuminating faces that flinched from it as though it burned. Venner stepped closer, his polished boots soundless on the damp floor. "We could ask what you've seen," he continued, "but I think we both know the answer. The real question is, how much longer do you intend to keep breathing after seeing it?" Thomas took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The prisoners had gone silent now, their eyes fixed on him, not with hope, but with pity. Venner closed the last few feet between them with the calm inevitability of a predator that knows its prey is already cornered. The silver tip of his cane traced the air between them, stopping just beneath Thomas's chin. It wasn't a threat in the obvious sense. No sudden violence, no raised voice, but it radiated a certainty that chilled him more than any weapon could. "You've walked into a room that doesn't exist," Venner said softly. "Do you understand what that means?" Thomas tried to answer, but his voice caught. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Behind Venner, the rain still hammered against the walls, muffling the outside world until it felt impossibly far away. Venner glanced over his shoulder at the chained figures. These people, they were removed from the world because they were inconvenient. No family, no coin, no voice anyone would miss. Officially, they've been gone for years. And yet, he gestured lazily with the cane, as if showing off an exhibit in his cabinet of wonders. Here they remain, breathing, waiting. Thomas's eyes locked on the nearest prisoner, a man whose cheekbones jutted sharp beneath translucent skin. The man's lips moved without sound, forming a single, unmistakable word: a run. Venner saw the flicker in Thomas's gaze and smiled, not warmly, but like a cat watching a trapped mouse think it's found a hole. I don't believe in waste, Venaire continued. Everything, everyone can be repurposed, even you. The cane withdrew from Thomas's chin, but before relief could settle, Venaire's hand shot forward and gripped his shoulder with iron strength. The smile never left his face. The trouble is, he murmured, repurposing requires ownership. And I'm afraid, Mr. Greeley, you crossed my threshold the moment you heard their voices. That makes you mine. Somewhere in the dark, one of the prisoners began to sob, a low, hopeless sound that rose and fell with the rhythm of the rain. Thomas didn't know if it was for him or for what they all knew came next, and then Venaire leaned in close, his breath warm against Thomas's ear. "Of the door you came through," he whispered, "it doesn't open from this side." Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the rain, the chains, even the sound of his own breathing. Venaire's words settled into him like a weight, dragging his thoughts toward a single truth. There was no way back. The grip on his shoulder loosened, but it wasn't mercy. It was dismissal. Venaire turned away, the tails of his coat brushing the damp stone as if the basement belonged to him as much as the air they were breathing. "You'll have your place soon enough," he said without looking back. "Until then, watch, learn, see how the machinery works." Two shapes moved in the shadows near the far wall. They stepped forward, tall, broad men in matching black coats, faces pale and unreadable. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The iron keys jangling from one man's belt said enough. One of them took Thomas's lantern, plunging half the room into darkness. The other seized his arm and dragged him toward an empty length of chain. The steel cuff was cold, shockingly cold, and the moment it closed around his wrist, the sound of the lock clicking felt final, more final than any word could make it. Venaire's voice cut through the dark. "Do you know why I prefer the dead to the living, Mr. Greeley?" He didn't wait for an answer. "The dead don't argue. They don't resist. They simply serve." Thomas's eyes darted to the prisoners on either side of him. One was a girl no older than 17, her hair shorn close to her scalp. The other was a man in his 50s with clouded eyes and a mouth that worked soundlessly, chewing on words that would never be spoken. Venaire stepped back toward the stairs, his polished boots catching what little light remained. "Tomorrow you'll be processed," he said almost casually, as if scheduling a performance. "You'll be given a name that isn't yours. You'll be declared dead. And in time, you'll forget you were ever anyone else." The black-coated men melted back into the shadows. Somewhere above, a door creaked open and shut, and the sound of Venaire's footsteps faded until only the steady drip of water from the ceiling remained. Thomas pulled at the chain once, twice. The metal bit into his skin, and the futility of the motion sank into his bones. Around him, the others didn't even look at him anymore. Whatever hope they'd once had, it was gone. And in the suffocating dark, he began to wonder how long it would take before his own name slipped away. 2 hours bled together in the dark, measured only by the slow, rhythmic drip from somewhere above and the shallow breathing of the others. Thomas had no sense of time, whether minutes or days had passed since Venaire left. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was the thirst that became a knife in his throat. When the door at the top of the stairs finally opened, the light was almost blinding. Heavy boots descended, each step deliberate, the sound echoing off the wet stone. It wasn't Venaire this time. It was a woman, tall, severe, her hair pulled tight, her eyes the pale color of glass. She carried a wooden crate, the weight of it making her arms flex under her dark sleeves. She didn't speak as she set it down in the center of the room. The prisoners stirred, the faintest rustle of chains and shifting feet, their eyes drawn to the box like starving animals scenting food. The woman knelt, removed the lid, and began setting out metal bowls on the slick floor. The smell hit Thomas first, thin broth, metallic with the taste of rust and old blood. One by one, she ladled the liquid into the bowls, pushing each just close enough for the chain to reach. They drank quickly, desperately, like they knew there was no telling when the next would come. When she reached Thomas, she studied him for a moment, head tilted slightly. "Anu," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She placed his bowl down without breaking eye contact, then moved on. The broth was lukewarm and foul, but Thomas drank until the bowl was empty, the hunger in his stomach momentarily silenced. When he looked up again, the woman was standing by the stairs, speaking in low tones to one of the black-coated men. Her voice carried just enough for Thomas to catch fragments. "What's an order? Processed at first light. Papers already filed. Venaire wants." The rest was lost in the scrape of the crate being lifted. Before she left, She glanced back at Thomas. For just a moment, there was something, not pity, not kindness, but recognition, as though she knew exactly how quickly the walls around him were closing in. Then the door shut, the light vanished, and the sound of the lock sliding home sealed the dark around them again. Somewhere to his right, the girl with the shorn hair whispered a single sentence into the silence. "They make you disappear before they kill you." Thomas turned his head toward the whisper, but the girl didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, her lips barely moving as she spoke again, softer this time, as if the shadows themselves were listening. "They erase you on paper first," she murmured. "A birth record, work history, every name you've ever been called. Then they bury you while you're still breathing." Her words sank into him, heavy and cold. He wanted to ask who they were. Vanara's men, the woman with the crate, someone higher? But before he could speak, a deep creak rolled through the ceiling above, followed by the muffled shuffle of feet. The air changed. Even in the dark, he could feel it, that invisible tightening, like the whole room was holding its breath. From the far corner, the old man with the clouded eyes began humming, low and uneven, a sound that wasn't quite a tune but carried an eerie weight. It was enough to make Thomas's skin crawl, but no one told him to stop. No one even reacted. It was as if they all understood something he didn't. Then came the sound, faint at first, then growing, of metal wheels rattling down the stairwell. Two men appeared, pushing a narrow cart draped in a dark sheet. They didn't look at the prisoners. They didn't speak. The cart's wheels squealed against the wet stone floor as they rolled it to the center of the room. The men peeled back the sheet. Thomas's stomach clenched. On the cart lay a boy, no more than 12, his wrists bound in leather straps, his mouth gagged. His eyes were wide, darting from face to face, but not in confusion. No, in recognition. He knew where he was. The girl with the shorn hair turned her head away. The old man's humming grew louder. The boy thrashed against the straps, muffled cries spilling from behind the gag. One of the black-coated men leaned down, whispered something in the boy's ear, and the fight drained out of him instantly. Whatever was said was enough to hollow him in an instant. The men wheeled him toward the far wall, to an empty set of chains. The sound of the lock snapping shut rang through the chamber. The boy's breathing was ragged now, and though the gag muffled his words, Thomas could hear the rhythm of them. 3 words, over and over, like a prayer or a curse. The girl finally spoke again, her voice flat. "That's the last time you'll see his eyes look human." Thomas didn't know what she meant, not exactly, but he felt it in the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every heartbeat. The boy's eyes darted toward him once, a quick, desperate flicker, before they fixed on the dripping wall ahead. His shoulders trembled. The 2 black-coated men stepped back, their work done, and for a moment it seemed as though they would leave. But then the taller of the 2 reached into his coat and pulled out something Thomas couldn't place at first. A small glass vial, its contents the color of old honey. The man held it up, letting the dim light catch the liquid before uncorking it. The scent hit Thomas even from a distance. Sweet, cloying, almost pleasant, and yet something inside him recoiled. The man dipped a long, thin cloth into the vial until it was soaked through. Without a word, he pressed it against the boy's face. The boy jerked once, twice, his muffled cries sharp and frantic, then slowed, then stopped. His body went slack, his head lolling forward, though his eyes stayed open. Thomas's stomach turned. The boy was still breathing, still awake. But there was nothing in his gaze now, no fear, no pleading, no awareness at all. Just emptiness. The shorter man unstrapped the gag and began speaking to him in a low, steady tone, like one might to a sleepwalker. The boy's head lifted slowly, obediently, his blank eyes tracking the speaker without blinking. Thomas glanced toward the girl, looking for some explanation, but she only whispered, Take the self first. The body, that's just a shell after." The taller man put the vial back into his coat. The sweet scent lingered in the damp air, curling into Thomas's nose like smoke. Every instinct in him screamed to look away, but he couldn't. Not when the boy began to smile, slow, unnatural, as though each muscle in his face had to be coaxed into place. It wasn't a smile of relief. It wasn't even madness. It was the kind of smile you wear when you've been told to smile and your soul isn't there to refuse. The men stepped back, satisfied, and began to wheel the empty cart toward the stairs. In the silence they left behind, the old man's humming shifted. Deeper now, more deliberate. And Thomas realized with a cold jolt that it wasn't a song, it was counting. The humming stopped at 12. Thomas didn't notice the number at first, not until the old man's lips moved again, silently shaping the next count. 13, 14. Each number landed in the air like a drop of ink into water, spreading and staining the space between them. The boy, still chained, turned his head toward the sound. His smile didn't falter. His eyes didn't blink, but his lips began to move too, matching the old man's count. The girl beside Thomas lowered her voice to a bare thread. That's how they keep track. How long you've been gone. The floor above groaned again, and dust drifted from the cracks overhead. Somewhere up there, the faint scrape of furniture being dragged across wood. It was the same sound Thomas had heard in the opera house before they brought him down here. The kind of sound you notice only because it shouldn't be happening at night. Then, footsteps on the stairs. Not the hurried, purposeful steps of the black-coated men. These were slow, heavy. A rhythm that gave you time to dread each arrival. The others in the room straightened, not with hope, but with that strange, still tension that happens when every person understands exactly what comes next. The man who entered wasn't dressed like the others. No coat, no hat. Just a faded waistcoat, the fabric stretched thin over his tall frame. His hair was slicked back with meticulous care, a faint sheen catching in the lamplight. But it was his eyes that froze Thomas, sharp, assessing, like a man scanning ledgers for errors. He walked past each chained figure without hurry, pausing only to study their faces. When he reached the boy, he crouched down, tilting his head. Perfect, he said softly, as if inspecting fine glassware. You'll fetch a price before the month is out. But Thomas didn't understand, not fully, but the word price hit him hard enough to make his pulse spike. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was business. The man turned, his gaze falling on Thomas for the first time. And in that instant, Thomas felt the same chill he'd seen in the boy. That stripping away of self, that slow erasure. The man smiled faintly. Not yet, he said, but soon. Then he moved on, leaving Thomas with the sudden, sick certainty that his value here had already been calculated. Thomas kept his eyes on the floor, but it didn't matter. He could feel the man's presence even after he'd walked past, like a heat that lingered in the air, pressing against the back of his neck. The others didn't speak. They didn't even shift. Whatever happened next was a ritual they'd all seen before. The man stopped near the far wall, where a rusted iron door sat half hidden in shadow. He pulled a ring of keys from his waistcoat pocket. Not the clattering jumble of a jailer, but a small, deliberate set. Each key was different, ornate, like they'd been made for locks older than the building itself. When he turned the first one in the door, Thomas heard the mechanism inside give a low, grinding sigh. The sound made the hairs on his arms stand up. The girl beside him leaned forward just enough for her whisper to reach his ear. They keep the ones that aren't ready in there, she said. The dark makes them forget faster. The door opened inward, and something colder than the basement air poured out. A damp, stagnant breath that smelled faintly of mildew and iron. From within came a faint sound, almost like water dripping. But as Thomas listened, he realized it wasn't water. It was breathing. Slow, shallow dozens of breaths all blending together. The man stepped inside, his figure swallowed by the dark. Thomas strained to see past the threshold, but the light from the lamps only reached a few feet in. He caught the faintest suggestion of shapes, hunched, motionless, before the man disappeared entirely from view. Then came the voice, not loud, not harsh, calm, measured. A tone you might use to soothe a frightened animal. He spoke words Thomas couldn't quite make out, but the rhythm of them was steady, hypnotic. One by one, the breathing inside began to match that rhythm. The girl's fingers closed around Thomas's wrist, not to comfort, but to keep him still. But don't listen too hard, she warned. If you start breathing with them, it's harder to stop. A minute later, the man emerged again. He locked the door without looking down, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the basement walls. They'll be ready soon, he murmured to no one in particular. Dewey. And for the first time since Thomas had arrived, he realized ready didn't mean healed. It meant something else entirely. The man slipped the keys back into his waistcoat, and with that small, deliberate movement, the entire room seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in grim acceptance. The ritual was over for now. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he walked to the center of the basement, placing himself where the lamp's glow caught his profile in sharp relief. He took out a small leather notebook, its corners frayed from years of handling, and began flipping through its pages. Its pages. Thomas caught glimpses as the man turned them. Neat columns of ink, each line ending in a number. Names, dates, amounts. Every so often, the man would pause, glance at one of the chained figures, and make a tiny mark beside a name. It was quick, almost casual, but the effect on the marked person was immediate. Shoulders tensed, eyes lowered. The boy with the empty smile even stopped smiling. Thomas's stomach turned. He'd seen that kind of book before, not in real life, but in his father's stories about livestock auctions. Except here the entries weren't animals, they were people. When the man's pen hovered over a blank space, Thomas felt his throat go dry. The tip of the pen scratched faintly as it began to write. Thomas couldn't make out the letters from where he sat, but he didn't need to. He knew his name had just been entered. The man closed the notebook with a soft snap, slipping it into his pocket like a priest, tucking away a prayer book. Then he finally spoke. "So Weeks," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stone chamber. "That's all we have before the next shipment leaves. Make sure they're ready." No one asked who they were. No one asked where the shipment was going. The black-coated men simply nodded as if every part of this exchange was normal. The man turned for the stairs. Before climbing, he stopped and looked back, not at Thomas, but at the entire room. His gaze swept over them like a man surveying his holdings. "I don't care how," he added. "Just make sure no one remembers anything they were before." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading above. The heavy door to the stairwell slammed shut, and in the echoing silence that followed, Thomas realized the real terror wasn't in what they would do to him. It was in the knowledge that when they were finished, he might not even care. Hours passed in a haze of dripping water and the faint metallic rattle of chains whenever someone shifted their weight. No one spoke above a whisper, and even that was rare. The girl beside Thomas hadn't let go of his wrist, as if she feared he'd vanish if she loosened her grip. At some point, a faint vibration ran through the stone floor, rhythmic, mechanical. It grew louder until a door at the far end of the basement swung open and two of the black-coated men wheeled in a contraption Thomas had never seen before. It looked like an oversized dentist's chair, bolted to a heavy wooden platform with thick leather straps dangling from the armrests. Behind it, mounted on a steel frame, was a spinning mechanism, a vertical wheel lined with mirrored panels that caught and scattered the lamplight in dizzying flashes. One of the men pushed the chair into the center of the room. The other followed with a small wooden crate, which he set on the floor and unlocked. Inside were glass jars filled with a cloudy amber liquid, each containing something pale and misshapen suspended in the fluid. Thomas couldn't tell if they were organs, embryos, or something else entirely, but the sight made his chest tighten. A name was called. Not his. The boy with the empty smile was unchained and guided to the chair without resistance. They strapped his wrists and ankles, then positioned his head so he was staring directly into the mirrored wheel. One of the men began turning a crank, and the wheel spun faster, catching the lamplight in strobing bursts. The boy's breathing quickened, then slowed, then stopped altogether. Not from death, but from something worse. His chest moved in shallow, almost imperceptible motions, and his eyes locked wide on the spinning light. The man in charge, not Cornelius, but a lean figure with hollow cheeks, opened one of the jars and held it beneath the boy's nose. The smell hit Thomas even from across the room, sharp and chemical. The boy twitched, then his pupils dilated until they almost swallowed the color of his eyes. Thomas looked away, but the girl's whisper found him again. "You don't look too long. The light pulls things out of you, things you didn't even know were there." The crank slowed, the wheel stopped, and the boy's head sagged forward. When they unstrapped him, he didn't smile anymore. He didn't do anything at all. They led him back to the wall, and he let the chains take his weight like he'd been here forever. Thomas knew, without anyone telling him, that his turn would come. And when it did, he wasn't sure if he'd leave the chair as himself, or at all. They didn't come for him that night, which was worse. The waiting became its own kind of violence, a slow uncoiling in his gut that left him more hollow with every passing hour. Sleep came in fits, shallow, dreamless fragments that ended the moment his head tilted forward. The girl beside him had stopped speaking altogether, her hand still clamped around his wrist, but the pressure was weaker now, as though she was slipping into some place beyond the reach of this basement. The second night, they brought in another one of the jars. This time it was a man, older with a beard matted against his chest. He fought harder than the boy had. The black-coated men didn't bother with the wheel at first. They pinned him down in the chair and opened the jar under his nose. The smell hit the air like a living thing. It was thick, wet, and sweet, in a way that made Thomas's stomach churn. The man gagged, turned his head, tried to spit, until one of them forced his jaw open and held it there. Then they started the wheel. Thomas tried to keep his eyes on the floor, but every flash of light caught in the periphery dragged at his attention. The metallic rhythm of the crank seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Even with his head down, he could feel it probing at the edges of his thoughts, like fingers testing a locked door. The bearded man's screams broke into raw, wordless sounds. His legs thrashed, the straps holding until something in him just stopped. His head lolled to one side, his eyes glassy and unfocused. They unbuckled him, and when they led him away, he walked on his own, but not like a man, more like a sleepwalker following a voice only he could hear. Thomas caught himself wondering, just for a moment, what the voice might say. That was when he realized the most dangerous part of this place wasn't the wheel, or the jars, or even the men who worked them. It was the quiet thought that maybe, when it was his turn, he wouldn't resist. By the third night, Thomas understood the rhythm of the place, not because anyone explained it, but because his body had begun to anticipate it, the way prey learns the sound of a predator's footsteps. They always came in pairs, always with the chair, always with the jars, always with the jars. But this time when the door opened, it wasn't the black-coated men who entered first. It was Cornelius Venaire himself. He didn't belong in the basement. Everything about him was made for the stage. The tailored coat, the gleam of gold on his watch chain, the precise wave of his silver hair. He moved through the room like a man surveying a collection he owned, his eyes lingering on each chained figure just long enough to remind them of their place. When his gaze landed on Thomas, it didn't move. Cornelius stepped closer, boots clicking on the damp floor, until he stood only a breath away. His cologne cut through the stench, sharp, expensive, masking something rancid beneath. "We're not from here," Cornelius said, voice low and even. "You were passing through. You think that makes you different from them?" He gestured to the others without looking at them. "You think you'll be missed?" Thomas didn't answer. His jaw ached from holding it shut. Cornelius smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind you'd find carved into a mask. "Everyone breaks differently," he murmured. "Some are hollowed out all at once. Others, we take apart piece by piece. I prefer the second method. More educational." He stepped back and nodded to the men who had followed him in. They wheeled the chair forward, the mirrored wheel gleaming in the lamplight. "Tonight," Cornelius said, "we see what you're made of." The men unlocked Thomas's chains. The weight on his limbs shifted, blood rushing back into places it hadn't reached in days. For a fleeting second, he thought about running, but the only way out was past Cornelius, and those eyes told him exactly how that would end. They gripped his arms, steering him toward the chair. The leather straps hung open like patient jaws. The wheel began to turn, slow at first, catching the light in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Cornelius leaned in close, his voice meant for Thomas alone. "When the light finds you," he whispered, "don't fight it. Fighting just makes it worse. Makes it worse." The straps closed over his wrists, his ankles, his chest, each one pulling tighter until the chair felt less like a seat and more like a coffin. The men stepped back. The wheel kept turning. At first it was only light, fractured beams spinning in the mirrored surface, brushing his vision like moth wings. Then the sound began, a faint hum, so low it seemed to vibrate in his teeth. It wasn't coming from the machine alone. It was inside his head, building, filling the space where his own thoughts should have been. The smell followed. The jar had been opened somewhere behind him. That cloying, sweet rot seeped into the air, crawling down his throat until every breath tasted of it. His heartbeat stuttered, trying to keep pace with the machine's steady rhythm. Cornelius watched from the shadows, hands folded neatly behind his back. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they were hungry. The light grew sharper. Every flash seemed to cut into him, not just through his eyes, but deeper, into whatever part of him decided who he was, what he remembered, what he feared. Images bled across his mind, a street in daylight, his mother's face, a riverbank. Then they broke apart, pieces scattered like glass in water, and in their place came something else, a sensation of being pulled, thread by thread, out of himself. The hum swelled until it was all there was. The girl's grip on his wrist, the smell of damp stone, even his own name, all of it began to drift away. He understood then what had happened to the others, chained to the wall. They weren't dead because their hearts had stopped. They were dead because nothing of them remained inside. remained inside. Somewhere far off, someone said his name, or maybe it wasn't his name at all. Maybe it was just a sound meant to anchor him, to keep him from slipping completely. His vision narrowed. The wheel was the only thing left spinning and spinning, the light breaking and breaking and breaking, and then nothing. When his eyes opened again, the straps were gone. The chair was empty. The room was the same, but wrong, as if some layer of it had been peeled away. The girl was still there, but she didn't look at him. Cornelius stepped into view. "There," he said softly, "and now you understand."